Welcome to the Into Novus Knowledge Agronomy Podcast, your go-to resource for agronomic insights, technology solutions, and ongoing education. At Into, we combine agronomic expertise from soil analysis to best practice application methodologies to provide a holistic view for your yield optimization. Our focus is on practical strategies that improve efficiency and drive better results in the field. Join us for interesting discussions, expert advice, and the latest advancements shaping modern agriculture. Whether you're in the field, on the road, or at your facility, we're here to keep you informed and ahead of the curve. All right, welcome to the Into podcast. Thank you everyone for listening. Today joined by my counterparts, Derek Cottrill, Northwest Missouri, and Rodney Phelps in Western Illinois. How are you guys doing?
Good. Doing good, Nick.
Well, guys, I thought for this one, maybe we would kind of finally wrap up 2025 and then we could totally move into planning 2026, even though we're kind of already doing that now. But I thought this would be a good transition period. So one thing I thought we could start with is maybe what are those top three things that you learned from the 2025 growing season? I'd really put it into terms like what are the top three agronomic stories from 2025? And I don't know, Derek, if you want to start from the Northwest Missouri standpoint, what top three things did you learn?
Yeah. Well, they're not new necessarily, but I guess going back to thinking back, mine would be a little bit different for corn and soybeans. And I don't know if these are necessarily top three things I learned as much as they are what were the top three yield limiting factors, contributing to yield loss and things like that throughout the year. And for corn, if I think back to the beginning of the season, kind of going in order here, the first thing we were noticing, I think, emergence issues in my area were a lot more yield limiting in some cases in fields than what growers realize. That happens early on in the season. And then throughout the season, we kind of forget about it as the corn grows and the disease kind of, shadowed every other thing we had going on out there. And I think guys forgot about it. But, in April and May, there was a lot of ugly corn stands out there. A lot of that had to do with planting into dry conditions. We had a drier spring than we did, especially from the year before, but even below average rainfall. And so a lot of seed going into dry soils and then relatively cool soils. And we had a lot of sporadic stand issues, and certainly that can be yield impacting on corn. And then, of course, the second one with corn would be disease. Southern rust would be top of mind. Tar spot never progressed to a level in my territory like it had the year before, and that's just because the conditions weren't as conducive for it, but they were perfect. There was a wide window that was perfect for southern rust. And then last disease there is our opportunistic type pathogens like our stalk rots and crown rots and things like that. There was a lot of reports of lodged corn falling down corn towards the end of the year during harvest, and a lot of that had to do with the stalk rots or crown rots that moved in on a plant that was already stressed out type stuff. So disease would be my number two with corn. And then fertility, but this would go for corn and beans. Fertility, and for multiple different reasons. I think one of the big ones was especially if you didn't have a top dress application with all the rain that we received in June and July, or leachable nutrients, whether that be nitrogen or nitrate, sulfate, and even boron, something that's important at the end of the season and needed in relatively small quantities. A lot of that, if you did not make that application later on in that season, around that tassel timing, things like that, those were probably depleted in the soil. And then we started to dry up at the end of the season. And, a lot of that movement of nutrients into the plant for adding test weight and filling out grain wasn't there because we didn't have the moisture type deal. And so, like I said, that would go for beans too. My other one on soybeans would be weed control. Again, not new. But I think the biggest factor in why weeds were so bad in some areas was our poor growing conditions early. Even if you were on 15-inch spacings, there's a lot of 15-inch spacings that still weren't canopied by the end of June. And so that wide window where we didn't have full canopy, our trees started to break. And if timely post applications weren't made, there was a lot of fields that looked pretty ugly towards the end of the year, or guys were chasing weeds in soybeans for most of the year type thing. So those would be my big ones.
Awesome, Derek. Yeah, I should have. I kept saying learn, but I should have said that. Yeah, what are the top three agronomic stories, and we'll get into what we learned or gleaned out of them later. Rodney, what about you? What about in Northwest Illinois?
Well, we had some, we ended the year with a good crop, but as I look back, there were some things that in both crops that hurt us. One of the first is when we're planting that crop, it went in well, and different from Derek, we had great emergence on our corn crop and our bean crop. But then we went through an early wet, cool stretch. And so we got the corn out of the ground, but then we stressed it with wet feet and cool temps, and it just kind of it never went through the uglies, but it didn't do a lot of rapid growth. The soybeans, we had green ugly beans for a long time because we didn't get warm enough to start mineralizing sulfur, and therefore we just didn't get growth early on those beans, and so that took its toll. Um, and then, but then I'll say tongue in cheek, then when we did warm up, we went through rapid growth syndrome in the corn. Don't know that it hurt us, but it sure made that crop mature a lot faster than normal. Um, and then we had 100-degree temps in August for about 10 days on and off. Not 10 days straight of 100, but we would get in the high 90s and hit 100. And that took the top side off of the crop. Um, well, and during that time then, as Derek mentioned, we had disease come in and southern rust come in with a vengeance. But so did tar spot, gray leaf, anything you could think of come in late. And we were thinking that we had a really good corn crop, and early we did. But then when we coupled hot temp with late disease, it took the top off of it. And then the rain shut off at the end. And especially for our soybean crop, we needed that. They always say late August, early September rain to finish the bean crop off, and that's exactly what happened. We didn't get the rain. We went into a drought. If you look at the drought monitor maps, we were right in the heart of a heavy drought, and that just took the top off the corn crop and the bean crop. But I will say that the people that stayed with their plan and they worked their plan from start to finish, the yield may not have been of what they thought they had earlier, but they were rewarded fairly because they stayed with their plan and they didn't cut anything back. Had they pulled some things, mainly fungicide, I'll say, the people that cut that back or changed course in the middle, um, that crop wasn't as good. And Derek mentioned standability. We did have some standability issues where we maybe cut the plant a little bit. So that's where my head is right now.
Well, it's good, Rodney. Do my best not to try to overlap. There's a lot of similar things that I could say, kind of like Rodney. We had a wet start to things. We could get into that whole thing, but I guess just thinking about a couple top stories. One of them you guys hadn't mentioned yet, but that'd be the whole tassel wrap thing. That was probably the hottest topic all summer long, if anything. And just where those plants were wrapping that tassel or wrapping the leaf around that tassel and not coming loose, and we had huge silks. And we've talked a lot about what caused it. I know there's been a lot of talk about rapid growth later, and we had a lot of rapid growth this year. There's been talk about erect leaves, and there definitely was hybrid specific things. What potentially caused it, but Derek's brought up before to his guys, just talking about the dew points and how high those were. Well, the humidity was super high, and we got some excessive silk growth going on, which exacerbated the problem. Normally hybrids will silk early to avoid drought, and this year we had lots of lush silks going. We also did have that flag leaf wrapping around some of those tassels and holding it in, and we look at from a wind speed standpoint, it's pretty low for this summer compared to average, and that also probably weighs into it too. Not blowing the pollen around, not getting those flag leaves knocked off, and getting that tassel open. But I will say that for all the hype it got all summer, I do know some cases where there were some problems in the end, but a lot of times those kernels filled in and people didn't notice it by the end of the year. But definitely was a hot story, one of the most unique ones I've heard in my agronomy career. The other one, I mean, there's a lot of things I could talk about. Midsummer for us, we had some nitrogen loss. I could talk about the southern rust, which was a huge topic for Derek up there, and other places. We had it across the middle part of my geography. And so I guess I'll just say Southern Rust was big, but probably another mid-season story that was probably a hot one on X or Twitter, or whatever you want to call it, would have just been the fungicide applications and streaking, whether it be with drones, airplanes, etc. We could all argue why that is, and we could talk about where they set up properly. Was the operation correct? But we can't all agree that we didn't have as much wind this summer that would have covered up some of those sins that wasn't there this summer. And then that mid-season rain too. I guess I'd also just mention one disease nobody seems to talk much about, but becoming a bigger problem would be Phytophthora in soybeans. We get those wet conditions, we follow with dry, and then man, we had a lot of Phytophthora killing bigger and bigger beans every year. It seems like just the final one, I guess, for my top three would be that dry August. It strikes again. Went down as the second driest August on record in Colombia. I think it was the sixth driest month ever. They only had like a tenth of an inch there. So obviously that limited soybean yields. And we know that. We could tell that by seeing the yields in the end and knowing the folks that had a little rain in August and those that didn't. But to Derek's point, things like stock rot, et cetera, and the corn just took hold because it got that stress there at the end that it needed to take over. So, yeah, just a few things there. But when you start thinking about your yields from 2025, you start thinking about management for 2026, there's some things maybe to keep in mind. Some things you can build a plan around to manage. And as Rodney said, sticking to the plan. Other things, they're just like the tassel wrap, just a phenomenon that we hope was just a 1 year deal. With that said, I just roll back, I guess, with the same rotation we had there. Derek, starting with you, what are those top three things that you maybe learned, whether that be from trials or whether that be from field scale level things that you saw in 2025? What are some key learnings for you?
Yeah, I had a dozen trials or so out between fungicide and fertility in corn and beans. And again, I don't know if they're learnings as much as they are confirming some of our lead recommendations in my territory around corn and soybeans. And so, especially when it comes to the fungicide stuff, we always say this, whether it's herbicides or fungicides, use full rates and things like that. And one thing that really stood out, especially this year, is using full rates versus the lower end use rate. Most products, most fungicides are going to have rate ranges and things like that. And the one that I'll use as an example would be the Veltima fungicide from BASF, which would be in that premium tier of fungicides. And, their rate range is relatively small in that 7 to 10 ounce range. And, you think, what could 3 more ounces do? And what kind of benefit could it bring? And in a year like this, and I know every year is different in terms of what disease we get and then how long or how wide a window that disease is going to continue to progress. And this happened to be a year we had a very aggressive disease in southern rust, and that window in which it continued to develop and progress was very wide. And one thing that really stood out was that full rate going 7 versus 10. That 10 ounce rate bought that extra residual in there. Even just adding 3 more ounces was a big deal. And it wasn't just with Veltima. There's several good premium tiers out there that have the longer residual type activity to it. And using that full rate at that key VTR1 timing, in my opinion, just needs to be, that's, when we think of this next year, go ahead and at least plan on that application, using the full rate at that key timing. Whether or not you'll need to come back again a second time, history tells us you're probably not going to need to 9 times out of 10. This past year, though, again, where that southern rust was so severe in some of my territory, the second pass actually paid 2. But going into this year, if it were me, I'd at least plan on the full rate at that key timing. The second pass, also, I mentioned that second pass, that's where in years like this, where we're going through August with not only disease stress, but also we're impacting grain fill and we might be shorter in fertility. That's when that second pass is not only going after disease, it's going after stock strength. And so I mentioned I had a number of growers I was getting calls from during harvest with lodging issues and stock rot issues and crown rot issues. And, that second pass that's late, a lot of yield has been determined already. But one thing you will add there is stock strength. And where we did that second pass, the corns tended to stand a little bit better. Now on the soybean side of things, again, this was kind of more confirmation because we've been kind of leaning this way on our Rex with soybeans when it comes to fungicide or that reproductive timing application. And Nick, I know you and your territory have been doing this as well, but I'll be the first to say that not all fungicides are created equal, and there's some that are better in terms of knockdown or residual or even plant health for that matter. And in most scenarios, I'm going to favor that premium fungicide now. But what we've been seeing on soybeans, to where around my territory, at least as of now, most of our fungicide applications are not disease driven, meaning we don't, in my territory, have big outbreaks of frog eye or white mold and some of those really intense diseases. And therefore, what we've been noticing is the nutrition and insecticide really carrying a lot of weight in our fungicide applications this year. And so I would encourage people to consider maybe moving down a level in that fungicide, going with something maybe generic, if that means that it allows you in your budget to add that nutrition and insecticide. Because what we're seeing is in soybeans, the generic is fungicide, maybe the lower tier fungicide. It's adding some benefit, but it's performing with the more premium products just because we don't have the limiting factor of disease and things like that. And if that means that a lot of times allows enough room in the budget to continue to add the nutrition, which I think, as I mentioned just a minute ago, was one of my limiting factors, late season nutrition, we can still add that at a reproductive timing with the insecticide and still fall within our budget. Now, higher yielding scenarios, if you're going after 80, 90 bushel soybeans, things like that, you've invested a lot of money in fertility for those beans and there's a lot to protect. Those might be the fields where you still consider with going a more premium option. I'm not starting to say that generics are the same and have the same abilities as our premiums, but our average scenarios with our soybeans, that insecticide and nutrition is so important. I think you're fine getting away with backing off and maybe to a generic type fungicide and adding those other two components to really round out that reproductive application. Those would be probably a few of the big things in corn and beans that I took away from my trials this year.
Appreciate that, Derek. Rodney, what about you? What are some of the key learnings that you had this year? Top three.
So, kind of along the same lines of what Derek's saying, but a big learning is not everything works every year, but some things work every year. And I know that's kind of a what the hell's he talking about? Well, one of them, I did work with, I'm going to call them dry starters, so hopper box starters for Innova products, Complete Start Bio, those type of top graphites with biologicals in them. And I would say 90% of the trials showed a positive ROI or a positive gain, whether you're looking at the gain as more plants emerged or if you're looking at yield at the end. But uniformity, a lot of pluses using some of these newer biologicals and acids, humates, and in the products appears to me to be where we need to be headed. To Derek's point on nutritionals, biologicals, all of those. That was an aha moment in both crops, that when we added some biologicals, some nutritionals, some micronutrients, those type of things, we got a response out of the crop, not only in yield but in health, standability, robust plants, more pot sets in beans, just better kernel set in corn. So to Derek's point, you know, and in beans, I'll agree. If disease is not a limiting factor, we can use a lesser fungicide, but get nutritionals, biologicals, and those in there to help that bean crop. In the corn crop, I'm still leaning towards branded or premium tier fungicides. Corn crop seems to respond to those and needs those. And going into 26 with, you know, the budgets are tight. I'm still, all my trial work will say if we're only going to get one shot and one trip, we want to do it at that VT to R1, like Derek said. That appears to be the best timing. And also, I totally agree with Derek at the high rate on these products because we're only going to get one shot and get some nutritional in there. The big one that jumps out at me on a lot of our testing we did through Agronomis was boron, and boron's a big one at that timing, especially for pollen shed. Um, when we're trying to get kernels pollinated. And I guess the third one was not everything works all the time, but what I said before, if you have a plan, stick with the plan. Because some of the trials we said, we probably don't need to do that. So we pulled some things. Shame on us. We shouldn't have. So anytime you have a plan and you know you want to work that plan and follow it clear through. So that was probably the big three of the biggest ahas I had in the trial work I had out.
That's good, Rodney. Yeah, you guys have mentioned quite a few things. There's not a lot else I could add, but I guess the top three things for me to try to be somewhat different would be you guys mentioned it with Veltima or fungicide is rate matters, and for me it was really though looking at some stress mitigation, some PGR products that we had, you know, kind of running our standard rates and then looking at the label and running some trials where we pushed them up to the highest rate that was on the label. And yeah, one thing I found out of that, we can get some pretty significant response when we start pushing things to the upper limits. Now, obviously within reason and depending on what the product is, but I got some real responses by pushing to the higher end of things. Probably two for me. Number two would be we did a bunch of biomass sampling through our Agromotis project, and the big takeaway for me looking across all of our samples was just yeah, we're still need to work on micronutrients, namely zinc, manganese, boron. Those three were low all the time, consistently between the three of us and between our geography. So that's probably something we need to do a better job of. I feel like we're working on the zinc and the boron. Manganese is still we could have a whole show on manganese, but that's one you really can't build in the soil. You start looking at literature out there, and it talks about the need to put it on foliar. So that's something that we'll have to look at throughout the course of the next year. But that's another key learning. The last one is probably just mentioning something, but you can. I mentioned this to a group last week that I work with, but you can do everything you can to set up yield potential, but it doesn't mean you're going to realize it. And what I mean by that is I've seen this over the years, and this year I had a couple soybean trials where we really did. We had some treatments that really set the yield potential up. It was there, but when you only get a tenth of an inch of rain in August, you don't realize it. And now, what does that mean? Does that mean that weather dictates everything and we don't have a plan? No, not at all. It just means we have to make some observations in season to understand what did we do? Did we actually manipulate potential? Then maybe it's worth doing it again so we're set up for potential if Mother Nature cooperates. But it's just realizing that because if everything comes down to yield at the end of the season, then if it didn't yield, you may throw it out and you may have threw away a really good product that just didn't work on a fluke year. So I think that's something we all need to understand. Okay, guys. Well, I really appreciate you guys going through that. Just talking about what are some of the top stories of 25. What did we learn from 25 that we can take into 26? And I think next time we can really focus on planning out 26, which I know we're all currently already doing. But there's some things that we can talk about there. I know there's some latest news on glufosinate or Liberty resistant water hemp in Illinois being confirmed. And so I think there's a lot of things that we could add how do we handle that going forward from a weed control standpoint, especially with water hemp. So with that said, we appreciate you guys very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by Into Novus Knowledge. Please reach out to your Into agronomist if we can help in any way. Join us next time for more in-depth agronomic advice.